I know that's not written in the Bible, but this is the understanding that I have from God. And that understanding is much more truthful than what you'll read in the Bible, because the Bible was changed so much. And they didn't know about genetics back then. Man hadn't gotten to that point yet. Although God knew, man just hadn't figured it out, so they didn't have it in their vocabulary. They just called it the seed. So this seed was tainted ever since the first Adam and Eve. Now how come Adam and Eve weren't in the Word? Well, God knew ahead of time that they were going to be disobedient to God. So He used them. They were the first people to be created or put in the flesh, and they were the first to disobey God's commands, to not eat of the good fruit or the tree of good and evil, which means to not think with deception. Well, they already had the sin in their flesh, so they were going to end up with thoughts of deception, which end up to be selfish thoughts, and they just think about themselves, and that's the deception. They think about themselves rather than God. So this whole world became infected from Adam and Eve with these sins, and man looked at their sins rather than looking at God. Although there were a few that looked at God. Noah was the first man with faith. He was the first man in those first 1,000 or so years that came to faith in God. And at that time, God already knew ahead of time. He already planned it out. He knew Noah was going to have faith at that moment, and that's when the flood came. He timed it just perfect for that reason. Noah would listen to him, so he could get some of his people and some of the animals and things like that in this ark that he built. So these people that had faith, all the rest of the prophets that came after him, these people had faith, but they couldn't be made sinless because the Messiah hadn't been born and died yet. So they had to wait. Okay? So the Word had to wait to live in the prophets until the next age, when they get new bodies. Jesus talked about his other sheep. Well, that's his other sheep, the prophets. And these prophets, even though they were sinners, they came into obedience to God, and they did what He wanted them to do. That must have been very difficult to do. To want your way, your selfish ways, but yet be under obedience to God and do and say what He wanted them to say. And but they did very well, as far as we know. A lot of them died from their own people, the Jews. But the main thing is that these people were under obedience to God. When Jesus came, He was the first man since Adam to have the word to be a spiritual man. Adam was only a spiritual man for a moment in time, and then he got disobedient, and God left. He was still in God, but he was outside the Word. He didn't have full understanding. God removed that, and so him and his wife had to live in the sweat of their own labor. They were no longer in the rest of God. And we can get to that later. But so Jesus was the first man to receive the Word in his heart. He was born sinless, and about the time he was 30 or so, he was born of God, which means he got this word replaced, put in his heart, replaced the old self. Even though he was sinless, he was still of the world because he's born in the flesh, like everybody else. So his flesh was just like ours, and he was a man. Nobody recognized him as being a God. Nobody. How could they? God's invisible. His invisible thoughts. But they knew he was different from the things he was saying. His friends and family would have recognized him. The fellow Jews, the people, the religious Jews, they knew who he was. They knew he was a carpenter's son. They knew he wasn't studious in their Talmud or the scriptures that they taught all their children. Some were wealthy. Some had time that they could teach their kids. But Jesus was born in they didn't have a lot of money, so they didn't have time. He had to work with his dad, I'm sure, as a carpenter, as most sons did back then, and we did when we were kids. So he was just a common man. Nobody recognized him as God, and that's what the Jews were looking for. They were looking for a king. They were looking for a king that would come back and take them to their land, their promised land that they lost years ago, and the king would reign over them and give them a wonderful life. Well, that didn't happen at all. They were very upset that Jesus was talking about him being the Messiah. He was of God. They didn't like to hear that. They didn't want to know that Jesus was God and God was him, and they were one. Well, he was in the Word, so he could say those things. The Word was in him. It's the same thing I do. I say the same thing because I have the Word living in me. Same Word that's living in Jesus. And that's how we know things. The Word is God. God's understanding of all things. Now we know things. Jesus knew things that he never knew before that Word came in to live with him. He didn't know all those things. He knew who God was. He was sinless, so he knew who God was. And God guided him, in his earlier years, but he still didn't have that understanding. And you can't have it until God is living in your heart. It's living in your heart.